Hi, my name is Allison Grayson with Independent Sector. Welcome to a special deep dive edition of Independent Sector's Week in Washington, which is a webinar series discussing advocacy and policy impacting nonprofits amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's webinar is titled Use Your Voice to Save the Vote, because we're going to explore in depth why safe elections in 2020 are critically important to nonprofits' ability to advance their missions. However, I want to reassure you that we will also be providing you an up-to-date assessment of federal policies impacting nonprofits. So the webinar will run a little longer than our typical 30 minutes, but we're really excited to be able to have this special deep conversation with our experts today. So today, since I mentioned our experts, and you can see them, we'll be joined by my colleague Neisha McGee at Independent Sector, Lindsay Torrico with United Way Worldwide, Chris Bruce with the ACLU of Georgia, and Washington Council Ernst & Young's Wes Coulam. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks.
Hi, hello.
Happy to be here.
Thank you guys for your time today. I want to give our participants just a little housekeeping. As a part of our feature, all lines are currently muted. And we will pause periodically for questions. If you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box within the Zoom platform, or you can email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. We're going to stop periodically throughout the program for you to be able to ask questions. So our speakers are ready for any kind of information that you would like to glean from them. This event will be recorded and posted on Independent Sector's website and will be emailed to you within 24 hours of the webinar. And when you leave today's call, you'll be prompted to take a survey that we encourage you to fill out, because this is what enables us to create programming that really meets your needs. So before jumping into our really exciting in-depth discussion about elections, we do want to hear about what's happening in Washington around federal policies impacting nonprofits, including legislative vehicles to ensure safe and healthy elections. So I'm going to turn to you, Wes, to get us up to date.
Great. Thanks, Allison. Happy to be with you this afternoon. I'll kind of go through kind of what's happening in Washington with Congress and kind of a little bit of the schedule and kind of what's on their agenda as far as legislation is concerned. Congress right now, from a schedule standpoint, is out working in their home states. Not set to come back until July 20th for a 2 to 3 week period where they're going to try to accomplish a lot if they can in that couple week period before they leave again for an August summer break. So a lot on the agenda between now and beginning of August for Congress. It's been an interesting year, as you know, in the economy in the country and also with Congress, and they've really been focused on responding to the COVID crisis and how to deal with the economy, unemployment, etc. And so, as people know, they passed a large bill called the CARES Act in March. Some smaller bills since then to deal with some of the small business loan programs. But now they're looking at another phase, if you will, of significant relief to deal with the crisis and to help the recovery in the economy. In May, the House passed a large package, about $3 trillion plus, called the HEROES Act, additional funds for the economy, additional tax rebates, tax breaks, funding across the board of various programs for individuals and organizations, loan programs, etc. And that is kind of pending, if you will, with the Senate. They have not acted on that legislation passed in May. Senator McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, has said they're going to respond to that legislation when they get back in July. And I anticipate Senator McConnell putting out a proposal around July 20th or that week when they get back to respond to what the House has already passed. I expect the Senate bill to be much smaller than the $3 trillion plus bill that passed the House, and more targeted and focused on ways to help individuals and businesses recover in the economy and respond to some of the healthcare needs also in the crisis. One area that I think we're going to talk about today is focused on, and that is election funding. The CARES Act had about $400 million in there for some election funding, of a $4 billion overall goal. the HEROES Act did include several provisions kind of based on the Access Act from House Administration Chairperson Zoe Lofgren. In that bill, it has funding, about $3.6 billion in funding for states and local governments to help deal with election emergency contingency planning, help fund federal elections going into this fall. It also expands early voting, access to voting by mail, other ballot requirements changes, as well as absentee ballot requirements, other requirements for voter registration, same-day voter registration, etc. So several provisions in there, that package, in that bill, dealing with election funding and voting. Obviously, the key is to help fund elections, and so the $3.6 billion in that bill is also key to help effectuate those provisions, those changes in the law. So from a standpoint of timing, I think that the Senate is going to take up a response to the House bill in July, and that will kind of kick off a negotiation between both Senator McConnell and the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, as well as the White House with the administration, and then obviously Speaker Pelosi and the House members to also negotiate a package with the goal, try to pass something by the end of July, first part of August, before they leave for their break. So that's something to watch. So we have some time here, but obviously things are going to move fairly quickly, I think, in July. And so the time is now to advocate and talk to members of Congress about the needs for these changes in this funding in this package. So that's kind of, I think, where things are in the bill. The longer term is also appropriations bills that the House is processing this week and next. I don't see them getting done between now and August. And they'll probably have to do some sort of larger negotiation on the budget when they come back in September, as they always do towards the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. And so that's also on the horizon, next budget fight taking place in September.
Thank you, Wes. So I have a couple of questions for you. I also want to give our participants an opportunity to ask some questions. So just as a reminder, if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A box, or you can send them to publicpolicy@independentsector.org. So while we're waiting to see if our audience has questions, I'm going to get down to it, Wes. I actually am going to put a pin in some of the things you mentioned around the elections funding, and I want to come back to that. So first I'm going to ask, in addition to elections funding, a lot of times we've been talking on this call about provisions that are sort of more nonprofit specific. So things like the charitable deduction, inclusion of nonprofits in the PPP program, and then sort of expansion of nonprofits being included in that program. And these are all provisions that I think the sector has been asking to be included in the next COVID relief bill. And we know that there's going to be a series or some advocacy happening on the Hill next week, a week in action. Independent Sector is planning an event, United Way Worldwide is planning an event, and many other nonprofits. So can you just fill me in, Wes, on like, what is the progress? I know we get questions about unemployment insurance related to nonprofits quite a bit on this call. So what is the status of the different provisions that are a part of the Relief for Charities effort, and what are the prospects of those provisions getting into any upcoming legislation that you see on the horizon at the end of the month?
Good question. I think there is ongoing negotiations on some of those provisions. For example, you have two kind of loan programs that help people recover and businesses recover. One is the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. Is for smaller organizations, 500 employees or less. There's legislation to expand that to include more organizations, larger nonprofits in that space, as well as expand some of the available tools and loan forgiveness for that program. So hopefully that will be part of the conversation in the upcoming negotiations and part of the final package. There also is legislation in there dealing with the mid-size loan program. I think the sector has been pushing to expand that program for larger nonprofits to include better terms for nonprofits, since that's something I think people are looking to also include in that package to help expand that benefit. The House bill did not include an expansion of the charitable deduction provision that was in the CARES Act for a $300 above the line universal charitable deduction that was in the CARES Act and is currently in the law. Well, there's efforts, as you know, on the charitable sector to increase that amount, to expand that benefit so it could be more beneficial to the sector. That's something I think that is working on hopefully getting included in the next package. Not in the House bill, as I mentioned, but it's something on the table being discussed as part of the response in the Senate and negotiations in the back and forth. The unemployment insurance piece, they had a $600 per week increase in unemployment insurance benefits for folks that were unemployed due to COVID-19. They would, that expires on July 31st. So that's going to be a topic of negotiation between the House, the Senate, and the White House. The Republicans are more interested in trying to modify that to include some sort of worker bonus rather than continue to fund unemployment insurance for folks who are unemployed. And that's going to be a topic of negotiation in the bill as well.
Great. So we have one question that is about the HEROES Act, but it's sort of in the context of election funding. So the question is there funding for the U.S. Postal Service in the HEROES Act? And then the second part of the question is because the Postal Service will need increased capacity to handle mailed in votes. But I think the real question is there increased funding in the HEROES Act for the Postal Service? Are you aware of that, Wes?
I have to go back and look at that detail in the language. I've not read that. There is language in there to provide prepaid postage for folks to mail back their absentee ballot applications and voter registration applications, so they don't have to pay for the postage themselves. That's the only thing that I note off the top of my head that's in the package.
Yeah, I think specifically related to the voting piece, prepaid postages in there. I don't know if aid to the Postal Service is included elsewhere in the package. I know that has been an ask generally, even separate from the election. So maybe we can, I will actually commit to looking at and posting it in the chat box in just a minute. So Wes, my last question on elections. I've heard from a lot of the election experts that this 3.6 billion and all the changes it's meant to fund will actually take some time to get underway. And so really state election officials are running out of time to make these changes unless funding is passed fairly quickly. So a lot of people believe getting this provision into the next COVID emergency bill is critically important. But also you mentioned the Senate bill is going to be significantly pared down compared to what was in the House bill. And we're not really sure if without significantly more advocacy that the election issue will make it in. So I just want to sort of get your sense of what is the Senate's thinking around the election? How is it currently prioritizing it? And if it's not a top priority, what can nonprofits do to kind of make it clear that this is something they need to pay attention to as an immediate need?
Yeah, good question. So just on the overall numbers, like I said, the House bill is about $3.3 trillion. Senate Republicans have been talking about somewhere close to the neighborhood of $1 trillion, so about a third the size of the House bill. So whatever they do is going to have to obviously be pared back to fit in that number. Now it could grow over, between the negotiations, so forth to come closer to, split the difference of, for example, like 1.5 or closer to 2. But I think that, the initial bill from Senator McConnell is going to be closer to 1 trillion and much smaller than the House package. So I think the sense that I get from Republicans is they're not as, it's not a high priority for them to get this funding in there. So it could be an effort that needs to be pushed on the Senate side with both the Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats, and then the House folks to kind of help maintain what was in the House bill to stay in the final product. Whether it's the full 3.6 or if there is a negotiation to do something, but not quite as much 3.6, it's unclear. There's no question this would all be subject to negotiation and back and forth, and so it could find its way in the package, I think. But possibly could be a smaller amount. Now, if it doesn't make it in the package, I think for timing wise, it's likely to pass by the end of July, first week of August. The next opportunity would be, as you know, time is of the essence. That you need the money pretty much yesterday. So the next opportunity would be probably in September when they deal with the appropriations budget deal at that time. So the hope is to get it in this package now and get it done by the end of July.
Great, thank you, Wes. I think you've been able to sort of lay the context for the environment in which we're considering this really important issue around elections funding and what it means for nonprofits. So now that we have the lay of the land of the policy environment, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Neisha to lead the conversation on, okay, so what are we exactly talking about when we're talking about this policy, and why exactly does it mean a lot to nonprofits at a time where we have a lot of policy priorities? So why are we adding another one to our list? Neisha, not a small question to answer, but I'm going to turn it to you and our experts to answer it.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Wes. Again, we have Chris and Lindsay. Thank you both for taking the time to join us today. Lindsay and Chris, please share with us a little about your organization's missions and why you see voting and elections as an important policy issue for your organizations.
Sure, I can jump in. So again, Lindsay Torrico from United We're Worldwide. And first, let me say thank you to Independent Sector for hosting this discussion. It's clear that this needs to be a priority for the sector, and we're grateful for your leadership in prioritizing this conversation. So really the mission of United Way is to fight for the health, education, and financial stability of every person in every community. And in order to fight for those issues, we know that means that people need to be active, they need to be engaged, and they need to be empowered members of their community. And this is more important now than ever. People are hurting in our communities. They feel helpless. They're angry about the failures of government at all levels and on both sides of the aisle. And they're frustrated by more and more cases of Black people getting killed by police. And so there's a lot of anger and frustration and hurt in our communities. And so civic engagement is critical to ensuring that people have the tools and the resources and the information to be able to fight for the issues that they care about.
Sounds good, Lindsay. Again, Chris Bruce here at the ACLU of Georgia. Neisha, Allison, thank you for having me, and Independent Sector for, again, dealing with this critical issue at a critical time. Something that the ACLU, which for over 100 years has worked on to protect and expand the sacred right to vote. Because let's be real about this. The first step in protecting your civil rights and civil liberties comes along with voting. So the ACLU of Georgia fights for voter suppression, fights against voter suppression, pushes for fair districts when it comes to redistricting, ensures that counties comply with state and federal laws, including what you have in the VRA, in the Constitution, and in federal courts. So voting rights advocacy involves litigation, legislation, and advocacy. And the job of my team, the political team, is literally to put the litigation team out of business. And that's by lobbying the state and local boards of elections to get things right so we don't have to go to court. Because we know the right to vote is fundamental in our democracy. And whether by litigation or advocacy, the ACLU of Georgia will continue to work to expand that access and that right. And it's literally in our DNA. The ACLU of Georgia actually comes out of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project, which was centered in the South, in Atlanta, when we were dealing with civil rights issues when it came to the civil rights movement.
Thank you. During an election year, when there are an overwhelming number of policy issues that require nonprofit support, why should nonprofits expand their advocacy to include emergency funding for the 2020 election in order to secure safe elections and voter participation?
Lindsay, you want to go again?
Sure, I'll jump in. You know, I think, you know, what we often share with our local United Ways is that, you know, we can't achieve and advance our impact goals if a large portion of the communities we serve aren't part of the political process. If they aren't at the table helping to shape and solve these challenges, then we are not going to have we're not going to get anywhere close to achieving these lofty goals we have. So I think this gets to a larger shift that we need to make as a nonprofit sector, which is not only advocating for people, but advocating with them. There's a great phrase in the DEI community, diversity, equity, inclusion community, that says something like, not for me, but with me. And so, yes, absolutely, we should advocate for more funding for COVID-19 relief. We should advocate for our nonprofit sector priorities. We should advocate for more funding for education programs, for nutrition programs, for housing. But we should also advocate for an expansion of the systems and policies that allow more people to participate in the process and fight for their own communities and help co-create these solutions along with us in the nonprofit sector. So, that's really the message that we try to share with our network, that it's not just about the work that we're doing for communities, but it's about the work that we're doing with them.
So we hear it all the time that this is the most important election of our lifetime, but literally 2020 may be the most important election of our lifetime. And it's happening in the midst of a global pandemic. And so many important races and policies are on the line, including redistricting, which happens, we know, every 10 years. And it's going to determine the next 10 years of how elections and people are get into office. So safe, accessible elections this cycle will require a wealth of resources, investments in personnel to address the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when the average age of poll workers across the nation is very high. For example, in Georgia, the average age of a poll worker is 72 years old. And organizational coordination to secure polling locations and having them adequately staffed to do these type of things really goes into the investments that we need to make. So in our primary, the pandemic created a situation where no matter how you were going to vote, either absentee voting, early voting, or on election day, you are likely going to run into a major issue, which it could be 5 or 6 or 7 hours in lines, or your absentee ballot never arriving in the first place. So funding for widespread, reliable absentee voting, including mailing out applications and processing the applications, sending out the ballot and processing the ballots on time, is essential when we're doing things, especially during the global pandemic. And nonprofits should be leading the way in that.
Absolutely, agreed.
Hey, Neisha.
Yes.
Can I jump in, because I was really
absolutely
by what Lindsay and Chris said. The other thing that we've heard in this space, which is a little more selfish, admittedly, than what Lindsay and Chris already pointed out, but we are most effective as advocates at the community level, and particularly policymakers want to hear from their own voters. And so the way that we are able to advance our missions and get the long-term systemic change that we're all working for through the policy process often is reliant on being able to mobilize our own constituents and making sure that those constituents are voting. And therefore, they're able to hold policymakers accountable to their own needs and to our nonprofit agenda. So I know, at least from an independent sector standpoint, we also view this as a way of strengthening nonprofits' advocacy and their ability to sort of move long-term change.
I think that's a great, just to add to that, I think that's a great point, Allison. And I think, often, we're realizing that we can't just make the mission case for this work, but also how do we make the business case? How do we talk about how engaging this work will give, sort of give you the muscle to be able to work on other issues. A lot of our United Ways don't have the capacity to do advocacy. They don't have the capacity to go lobby on Capitol Hill, but they can in their conversations with people, in the services they provide, talk about, hey, have you made sure that you're registered to vote? Have you completed the census? So there are small things that they can do to engage in this work. And once they get that sort of muscle to see the value of that, they can do more work along the sort of spectrum of ways that they can advocate. So I agree with that we've got to make the case for, doing this, how doing this work will strengthen our organizations at large.
And like you were saying, who better to do that than the nonprofits who are always in the community? So the nonprofits are the ones who are going to say, these are the people who are going to be most at risk. These are the people who are going to be most affected. And these are the people who need the funding or the emergency funding that's going along anyway. So it not only affects the nonprofits to get through their mission, it affects the communities to get through the mission that we do serve with.
Absolutely. I also wanted to ask you a question regarding some of the concerns surrounding marginalized or disenfranchised voters. A recent study concluded that 67% of Americans believe that the pandemic will likely impede the ability to vote. Even with such widespread agreement that voting rights may be impacted, it likely will not impact all voters equally. In short, this is an equity policy issue. Please help us to understand who is at greatest risk of not being able to vote this election.
You want to start, Chris?
You know, why not? I'll do it. Thanks, Lindsay. So we've seen in recent primary elections how COVID-19 has actually affected people. And I can definitely speak for Georgia, where we witnessed countless last-minute polling location changes, largely making it more difficult for people to vote in communities of color. So for example, in Fulton County, our largest county in Georgia, voters on the southern area of Fulton and Atlanta, a predominantly Black area, often had to wait more than 4 hours in line, whether it was on election day. While on the other hand, several voters on the northern area of Fulton and Atlanta, a predominantly white area, reported a very smooth voting process where people are out in 10 minutes. And this is within the same county. And we know that this doesn't just happen in Georgia, it's happening all across America. So we know that they are mostly affected, people of color. And when election administration becomes a challenge, those at the margins get hurt the most. So when voting machines are down and ballots aren't arriving, considerations like language barriers in certain areas like Gwinnett County and others, people who have Spanish as their majority language, and something that people don't talk about enough, but access and ADA compliance can go out the window at certain times. So during a pandemic, especially, so these things happen without a pandemic, but during a pandemic, those who are vulnerable in health are forced to choose between their health and their constitutional right to vote. And we see COVID affecting Black, Latinx communities and disproportionately nationwide. And with so many students at home, their registrations become an issue as well, where they are registered at college, instead they live at home, and there may be confusion within it. So historically disenfranchised communities, people of color, youth, those who are incarcerated, I mean, the list goes on and on. What we need to be most mindful of, paying attention to those communities that our nonprofits already serve, and making, again, voting easy and accessible for them as well.
Yeah, I would just pick up on what Chris said. Even before the pandemic, I think often communities of color were missed by political campaigns. We know that political campaigns tend to reach out to the more likely voters. And so it creates this sort of self-perpetuating cycle where campaigns reach out to the people that are most likely to vote, and then the people that are left out of that cycle are those often that nonprofits work with. So I think our role has often been to create a more representative electorate. But with COVID-19, those challenges have been exacerbated. So you've got DMVs shuttered, right? You have people no longer doing door-to-door canvassing. Voter registration drives that many of our local United Ways had planned this year have been postponed. So the challenges are even harder this year. And so I think it's equipping nonprofits with the information and the training to be able to do more digital organizing. We've been partnering with other organizations to help our network that doesn't necessarily have that skill set to do the digital engagement, to be able to shift their in-person voter registration drives to virtual. so they continue to engage people in the political process through those means. But yes, I think those low propensity voters, the communities of colors, are those that often are going to be kept out of the political process, and even more so this year.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if I'm not mistaken, the CDC, they have identified numerous underlying medical conditions that render individuals from these communities as high risk for severe illnesses that would definitely be fatal if worsened by COVID-19. So to Chris's point earlier, increasing our efforts to get more staffing needs so we can have healthy and secure voting places is absolutely critical. So we need to make certain that Congress appropriates the emergency funding. Additionally, fear surrounding the pandemic has promoted last-minute changes to voting procedures and fostered an environment of disinformation. Research indicates that a distinct value nonprofits bring to the election process is that we're trusted sources of information in an election year. What role should nonprofits play in combating disinformation surrounding changes in election procedures, registration dates, requirements, deadlines, and absentee voting?
There's disinformation in the voting process. Wow.
Who would have thought, right?
Whatever. Oh, but you know, I was going to start by saying, you know, nonprofits should be at the forefront of combating disinformation, but I believe nonprofits are already at the forefront of doing this type of work, and they need to be at the forefront, as what we've been saying before with Lindsay. I mean, you know, voters have been facing uncertainties while attempting to fill out their absentee ballot applications. For example, in Georgia, due to an error on the part of a third-party vendor, ballot instructions did not include the ballots. Voters were confused by the presence of like sheriff races, though only in certain ballots, you needed 2 stamps on one ballot, you needed 1 stamp on another type of ballot, but there were no instructions towards it. And I know I'm probably saying this in a confusing way because it really is confusing, especially when your Secretary of State is not explaining these things to you, or your local board of elections is not explaining things to you. So the country, as well as Georgia, saw a lot of confusion around the use of new voting machines, which we just got. When voters are entities that provide provisional ballots, where voters were requesting absentee ballots, how they were receiving these ballots, a lot of people just did not know how this voting process was going to go. And you'll hear from different areas of saying, well, voting was easy, like we said before in my area, but when voting is not easy in other areas, that's not what America and democracy really stands for. It needs to be easy and accessible all the way around. And it's those local organizations and nonprofits that are in the communities every day that should be explaining to their members how the voting process goes. So for example, in Georgia, a lot of the problems happen again because the average age of a poll worker is 72 years old. And a lot of those poll workers were saying, I'm not going to risk my life to do this type of work. And we shouldn't blame them for that. We shouldn't. So instead of blaming them, instead of blaming others in the Board of Elections, or even up top to the Secretary of State, the ACLU of Georgia is launching an initiative of poll worker recruitment, where we're going to recruit young professionals, younger people, lawyers to explain the voting process, and everyone else to say, we will capture our own neighborhood. We will run our own polling locations. Make sure that the people in your neighborhood are giving you the right information when it comes to voting. So again, you're not going to need election protection. You're not going to need to litigate these issues because the community surrounding by nonprofits are really taking over the voting process. Now, it's not an easy process, but it's another way that we're going to combat these type of issues, especially disinformation.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as you mentioned, Chris, I think there's a lot of distrust in government right now, right? So I mentioned that, you know, I think people are angry and they're frustrated that government is not protecting them from the pandemic, or is not helping them financially get through this challenging time. And so nonprofits can be that trusted partner for information about when and where and how to vote. And we're embedded in these communities that often state election offices and civic organizations are not. And so I think it's really about helping them to leverage the communications channels that they already have and partner with organizations and nonprofit associations that have the resources to provide that information. So just one example is United Way's operate 211s, which is a phone number that anybody can call for community services. So if they need, if they're about to be evicted, or they need food, or they need help finding a job, they can call 211, 95% of the country, and a 211 operator will connect them to community services. And so we've been talking about how can we leverage those 211 operators to provide information about voting and the census as well. How do we train them? How do we, give them the resources to be able to be equipped with that information if there are questions about voting? So I think it's often about taking the services that we're already providing to the community and how do we integrate information about voting and being that sort of referral one-stop shop for communities on where they can go to get the information they need to participate.
Absolutely, you're right, Lindsay. Nonprofits, since our inception, we have been the cornerstone of our communities. And I think we can all agree that ensuring that constituents have the right to vote safely and securely in the midst of the global pandemic, it's not a partisan issue, it's an American issue. And recent studies have determined that processes like mail-in voting don't benefit one party over the other. However, there are still concerns regarding overcoming partisanship. Some perceive election funding as a partisan issue. However, there is strong bipartisan consensus on individual provisions in the emergency funding proposal, including expanding mail voting. A recent study determined that the American public from across the political spectrum broadly supports this initiative, as 4 out of 5 Americans believe states should give all voters the option of voting by mail without having to provide an excuse during the November election. Some members of the nonprofit community are reluctant to speak publicly about this issue, like voting or elections, due to the misperception that it is a partisan issue. How do we combat this perception to not only reassure nonprofits, but policymakers as well?
Lindsay, you'd like to start us off?
Sure, that's a loaded one.
Lindsay, you can go first.
Oh, how kind, how kind. Are you sure you don't want to do this one?
Lindsay and Chris, I'll give you a second to regroup and think about what your answer is going to be, because this also came across as a question from the audience. That some nonprofits say, oh, this is perceived, and even Wes, you can weigh in on this one too. This is a partisan issue. And a lot of nonprofits try their best to stay as far away from clearly partisan issues as possible. And they just don't feel comfortable taking positions on things that are perceived to be issues. And so as important as we have all outlined this to be, and the fact that Neisha just said that the reasons it's labeled partisan actually aren't true, perception, and even Republican-led states with Republican election officials are asking for this funding. The perception still is out there. And so what do we say to individuals or nonprofits or elected officials that say, you know what, I agree with you, this is important, but I can't be seen endorsing what looks like a really partisan issue? What do we do to help overcome that misperception?
Well, I'll just jump in on this one that, I think, and just stepping back a little bit, I think this is something we hear about doing civic engagement advocacy just in general, right? I think often what we share with United Ways is that the decisions to take policy action should be given careful consideration, and you should have a process, you should have a board policy committee that looks at those issues. And so you need to have a system and some policies in place to be able to take on policy issues or to take on voter engagement. But fear alone is not a good enough reason. Strengthening and improving our communities requires system level change. And so avoiding policy and advocacy prevents us from making the long-term change that our communities require. So as long as you take a smart and common sense approach to this work and work to build consensus and practical solutions, that the concerns around partisanship tend to be fairly minimal. And I would say the same thing on this issue as well. I mean, I think there are certainly interpretations about this being partisan, but I think you can talk about this work, you can frame it up as, and tie it and align it with your messaging about your organization and what your priorities are. And if you can make that case about why expanding opportunities and access for people to vote, gets at your mission, you can make that case. I think that addresses a lot of the concerns that folks have around these issues. So I think that the framing is important, and again, taking a very smart and sensible approach about how you work on these issues and who you partner with on these issues, right? Don't just maybe partner with the progressive organizations, reach out to other organizations as well. Then you won't have there won't be as many perceptions around partisanship, if that makes sense.
I completely agree with everything you just said, Lindsay, and the perception of it all really means something. I personally was working as a lobbyist as well. I know I've done my job when both parties are mad at me. And this has happened recently of saying it was actually a bipartisan bill that passed, and Republicans called me up and said, you should have worked harder to kill this bill. And Democrats said, well, you should have worked harder to bring more into this bill. I said, look, guys, you got the bill, so don't look at me. I'm doing what represents the people, which is the same thing that y'all should be doing. And another issue that I just dealt with literally today, talking to a Board of Elections member of saying the ACLU recruiting poll workers to work at polling precincts could be perceived as a partisan issue. So maybe y'all should just work behind the scenes if you really want to do this. And I told them, and it goes around framing, you're telling me that solving your problems when it comes to people walking off the job to being able to vote is a partisan issue? Like, I can't understand. Like, we're not marking down who's a Democrat or Republican, and we're not targeting anyone. We're literally helping you do your job. And this person was an ACLU member who was telling me this. So eventually, getting down to the nitty-gritty of everything, he finally understood this really cannot be a partisan issue. Not only that, it's not even something that you will vote on. This is more an administrative issue. So the right to vote is not a partisan issue at all. It is important for nonprofits to protect this fundamental right, especially during this pandemic. And we know that recent studies have shown that voting by mail does not give one party or another an advantage. Even though you may have commentators saying one way or another, unfortunately, they never research facts out there. I think that's what nonprofits do. Somebody will say something, a nonprofit will come back and say, well, according to this study, what we've looked at, though, that states who have expanded voting by mail, that both parties typically have an equal increase in voter turnout altogether, which is something that we should all strive for. So nonprofits and even policymakers need to realize that advocating for vote by mail options and other options is not a partisan issue. Instead, it's a solution for voting access problems that we know that we face already.
I would just add one more thing, Neisha, here to what Chris and Lindsay said. And I just want to quote one of our community partners at the YWCA, Catherine Bean, and she said, it's not going to stop being perceived as a partisan issue until more nonpartisan people step forward and support it. So as long as we leave partisan organizations or individuals or policymakers to do the heavy lifting is going to continue to have that perception. So somebody has to step forward and say, no, I'm going to declare that this is not partisan and this is central to our community, and therefore we're going to take a stand on it. Lindsay or Neisha, I know we have a lot of questions too, so I just want to make sure we leave a little time for that at the end, and I think you have a couple questions left as well.
Yeah, I think just one more question. Acknowledging that nonprofit advocacy and mobilization already has its own set of unique capacity issues, and understanding that nonprofits are already stretched these days. So it's particularly challenging for us to take action on more than one issue. What are some of the individual initiatives that you found to be most successful in your efforts to support your advocacy initiatives?
You want to start that one, Chris?
Yeah, I can do that. And in fact, I'm glad you said that because I want to tip off of what Allison said. Are Atlanta Hawks the best basketball team in the NBA? Since they're not playing in Orlando, they're actually making our stadium as a voting center. And this is something that's been hailed as a success between all parties of saying, this is great that they're doing something to deal with vote. I'm going to vote there, definitely. But I think I echo exactly what you say. When more nonprofits that are nonpartisan get into this realm, voting will be seen as a nonpartisan issue. So some of the things that we've been doing, especially when we just got off of our legislative session, is literally virtual lobbying days where we would talk to people about issues and giving them the information, first educating them, and then empowering them to talk to their own legislators. And we would be the connect for them to advocate with their legislators. We also had a lot of sign-on letters for legislation and participating in Twitter storms of getting this issue out in front and letting other people actually see what's happening. There's several other things that I think have been happening, but in the interest of time, I'll just save them for our questions.
Lindsay, what opportunities do you think are available for nonprofits to amplify our voice on this particular issue?
Well, we can go with basketball teams. I'm from Philly, you know, so we won't go there. But, you know, I would say the capacity challenges that nonprofits have are real, particularly small nonprofits, particularly right now as they're trying to, you know, quickly respond to the basic needs that folks are struggling with. But I always say start with the work that you're already doing. Look for ways to integrate into your events. If you're having community conversations, if you're having town halls that are virtual, you know, take a moment and talk about how people can be engaged in your communications. What we've done over the last few months is launch a campaign called United We Count, United We Vote, which is a communications and a public awareness campaign to encourage people to be civically engaged by taking the census and registering to vote and then getting out the vote. And so we're providing our United Ways with toolkits and opportunities through Twitter storms to just simply to share the message, to spread the word to their community in really, really small but tangible ways. And so if that's all that you can do, that's still really valuable. You're getting the message out there. And if you can do more, then look for opportunities to connect with efforts that are already planned. So we know this year there's a lot of exciting efforts happening. There's National Voter Registration Day in September. Vote Early Day is a new holiday focused on helping people vote early in October. There are lots of different civic events. Civic Health Month is in August. There's a new initiative called Power the Polls, which is an election worker recruitment campaign to get people to sign up to be poll workers. I think Chris mentioned that issue as well. So there are lots of existing opportunities out there. You just have to reach out, talk to some of these organizations and look for small ways that you can support the cause. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there should be no excuse, I would say, for you not to do something, even if it's simply sending a tweet or participating in an event, because there's so much rich, amazing content and opportunities out there.
Absolutely. If it's okay with you guys, I'll go ahead and proceed to some questions that our attendees have asked. So we have one that asks, if United Way deploying volunteers nationally to help potential voters register and help communities prevent or overcome voter suppression efforts, if not United Way, are there other nonprofits currently recruiting and deploying volunteers?
Yes, we are, absolutely. So we are leveraging two groups of volunteers we have. One is called Women United. Women United is about 75,000 of our women volunteer leaders across the country. And their leadership group, they have given $1 billion more to United Way. And now we're taking that group that's volunteered and fundraised for United Ways, and we are helping to train them to do voter engagement work as well. We're doing something similar with a group of young people. We have young leaders and student United Way chapters across the country. Again, they've been very involved in volunteerism. They've been very involved in their fundraising drives in their communities, but now we're starting to kind of tap that group to also do digital organizing in their community. So I think, and I know many other nonprofits are doing similar work. I think we often don't realize we have this network of volunteers that have been working with us for so long, and now they're hungry for stuff to do, especially now that they can't actually do a lot of in-person volunteerism. So I think there are ways that we can use those groups towards this work. The other thing I'll mention is corporate employees. We've had some really rich conversations over the last few weeks with our corporate partners who are feeling the pressure, honestly, to respond to the conversations around social justice and racial justice. And they are looking for guidance from nonprofits on what do we do with our corporate employees that are really demanding that we step up and want to be empowered right now. And so we're having conversations with our companies around how can we provide their corporate employees with advocacy training, with digital organizing training, helping them to do voter registration drives, helping them to sign up to be poll workers. So I think that's really another important group that we can all sort of help engage and leverage in this work.
So we have another question. It's, ideally, voting should be seen as a nonpartisan issue. However, one party keeps trying to pass legislation to expand voting access, and the other keeps trying and succeeding in passing legislation to suppress voting access. So at the ground level, it does seem partisan. Your thoughts?
Ooh, Lindsay, you want to go?
Well, I think we partially addressed this in the sense that we talked about the perception issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the importance of messaging and, talking about and really framing this in. This is about making sure that everyone has the opportunity, right? And that vote by mail should not be a partisan issue because not one party has benefited from vote by mail policies so far. So I think that's a lot of it. I think the other piece also is about corporate engagement, and going back to what I just mentioned, one of the things I'm realizing is that companies are having conversations that they haven't had before around voter engagement and racial justice. And so if you've got companies that are starting to step up and realize we've got to support these issues, then I think it shifts the conversation from a partisan issue, because you've got pretty traditional companies that aren't seen as progressive, right? That are starting to step into this place through the Time to Vote campaign and other efforts. And so I think one strategy is getting companies to step up and be leaders, because that also addresses the partisanship issue as well.
Chris, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and maybe my statements will be a little bit more controversial. Of saying people in power like to stay in power, right? We can acknowledge that. People who are not in power want to become in power. So you have these two different groups going back and forth with each other. But when it comes down to it, are they really listening to the people altogether? Because in our democracy, the people that we elect are the ones who are supposed to go out and put forth an agenda for all Americans. And this is where the issues come into redistricting, how well you're able to vote, voter suppression issues versus voter access issues. We need to hold our elected officials accountable, whichever way it goes. It doesn't matter about partisan politics. It matters on holding the person that you have in office and making sure they represent the values of your community altogether.
Absolutely. Our last question.
Hold on, Neisha. I wanted to add one more thing that is slightly more cynical, but I think also speaks to George's question. I agree with Chris, but with independent sector and how we were thinking about how we should be advocating on this specific issue right now of getting the Senate and specifically the Senate Republicans to prioritize this issue. One of the things that we were thinking about is how do we frame this issue in language that they understand? That already, instead of trying to get them to come around to a lot of our own values as the sector, framing our needs in their values. And so we were talking about, well, maybe we need to talk about how healthy elections and safe elections are secure elections. And because election security is a big Republican issue. And if COVID is still happening in November in a big way, some communities might try to switch at the last minute. And that's the worst way to jeopardize election security is last minute changes to your voting process. Now is the time to invest in the proper procedures, right? So it's a little more cynical, but I think that there's also opportunity to reframe some of these issues in a way that people who wouldn't traditionally have been supportive may begin to think about it differently or understand it just by switching a frame or a language. Sorry, go ahead, Neisha.
No, you're absolutely right, especially as this pertains to even some of our rural locations nationwide. Last question. Of course, the 2020 elections are important and have their own set of challenges. Looking beyond 2020, what policies are your organizations advocating for to increase access and equity for all healthy elections?
Oh, well, I'll jump into it and I'll try to be as fast as possible. So 2020, and I tell this to everyone, this is just a pilot year. So we're gonna have elections after 2020. You're gonna have local elections in 2021. 2022, you're gonna have midterms, and you're gonna have another presidential election in 2024. So you're right. Elections are going to happen all the time. It's what are we going to do something about it? But the reason why 2020 is very important is because of redistricting again. So when they are redrawing the lines of saying, how is it going to look for the next 10 years? You need to make sure that the right person is in place to make sure that voting is fair and accessible to everyone. There are always these common sense measures that are in place that we need to advocate for when it comes to people who have been typically disenfranchised, that we can go through the litany of it. But when I say that, I believe that redistricting should be the top issue right now. We need to make sure that happens so we can get the right people in place to enact other issues that are going to affect Americans for the next 10 years.
I would just agree with exactly what you said, Chris. I think, everyone's seeing the 2020 election, November, as sort of like a, this pinnacle moment that it's good sort of, we're going to solve all these problems by then. And I think, we've got to continue this work. It's got to be ongoing. And, I think the challenge often is once you get through a big presidential election, then people don't care for another 4 years, right? And so you lose that momentum, you lose that engagement with our members, with the communities we serve. And so we've got to find a way to keep the momentum going, to keep people engaged and to make the case why we need them to vote in all elections and why we need the right policies in place that allow them to do that. So I think that's really going to be on us as nonprofits to make sure that there's not that fatigue and people haven't moved on to the next thing, because this is a continuous process of trying to create a healthier, more equitable democracy. So yeah, I completely agree with all of that, and you got to keep the momentum going.
Oh, can I answer Bob's question that he just put in the chat about the right people? So
Go ahead,
thank
Chris.
you. Real fast. The right people are the people who believe in American values that everyone has access to vote. It's not about your party lineage, or if you're blue or you're red. It really is, this person should be able to vote, and it should be easy and accessible. Simple.
I think we are at time. I want to thank each of you for giving us your invaluable insight and taking the time to speak with our members today. Wes, it's always a pleasure. Thank you as well. And we look forward to speaking with you guys next time. And there is a call to action. If you guys could please take a moment, share it with your network, tell a friend to tell a friend.